Try It Out Loud, a podcast by Chasing the Rainbows with your host, Bernice Quisenberry.
This week's podcast episode is Parenting After Loss Out Loud, and it's in honor of March being Pregnancy After Loss Awareness Month. On this topic, we are interviewing guest Michelle Valiukenas, and she is an executive director and co-founder of the Colette, Louise, Tisdahl Foundation, mother and baby loss survivor. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you on here and for us to discuss this topic that is so much needed, for all of us who are parenting after our traumatic losses. Will you share a little bit more about yourself for our listeners and survivors, your story? Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'm a mom of 3, 2 angel babies, and my only living child, my son Elliot, who is 3.5 and actually like 3 3/4 now. Our journey to parenthood was tough. So we had infertility, my husband and I, and an unknown reason. And we went through several fertility procedures. We have only ever gotten pregnant via IVF. And our first round of IVF, I got pregnant, and then I miscarried our child, Sweet Pea, at about 7.5 weeks pregnant. And then we went on, in our third round of IVF, I got pregnant with my daughter, Colette. And that was a pretty normal pregnancy. And at 21 weeks pregnant, I was hospitalized with severe preeclampsia. Unknown. Only symptom was that I went to the OB, and just on a standard appointment, they checked my blood pressure and it's 180/110. And so I was sent immediately to labor and delivery, and then later on told I would be in the hospital until I delivered. So that was sort of the impetus of a lot of things, of realizing just how quickly things can turn in a pregnancy, and, was in the hospital ultimately a little over 3 weeks before doctors recommended delivery. And so it was emergency C-section at 24 weeks, 5 days, and then straight to the NICU. And Colette was in the NICU, with all of the ups and downs and roller coasters of being in the NICU, for anybody who is familiar with that. And then after 9 days, we had known that there were some dangers in this. I don't think either of us had ever known that we could lose her. But for micropreemies, there is a ventilator that they put them on that's really supposed to be for 24 to 48 hours ish. And it's really just because their lungs are underdeveloped, and to kind of power their lungs a little bit, so to speak. And then they're supposed to be transitioned off of it. They had tried to transition Colette several times, and she never took. Her stats would drop. And so they finally got to a point where basically because it was such a high power ventilator, it had started to destroy her lungs. And so after 9 days, she gained her angel wings, and we lost her. And, I'm sure and I'm sure a lot of listeners know, is, losing a child is the worst experience that any parent could have. And probably, I would say, the worst experience any human could have. And then, a lot of isolation. But throughout my whole experience, I had really thought a lot about the financial piece, and the fact that, I'm thankful every single day that I was luckily in a situation where we could handle that financially. And, we had intended for me to be there for several months in the hospital. And, that was our hope. We were hoping to get as far into the pregnancy as we could. And how many families just couldn't have handled that, right? And that's everywhere across the spectrum, from, barely, living paycheck to paycheck, all the way up to making good money. But all of a sudden, if you lose an income or half an income, that can make a huge effect on financial situation. And so that had been my thing I had been thinking about throughout the whole journey. And, really just in this, I don't know what like what my status, my role, my position in life means now, I started to really explore this financial piece and
Yeah.
found out through all of my research that I didn't really feel like there was any place that was addressing all three stages of pregnancy, high risk and complicated pregnancy, NICU stays, and loss. And did my research, talked to social workers, did all of this stuff, and everyone over and over again was like, "You have to do something." And so we started a foundation in Colette's name, the Colette Louise Tisdahl Foundation, and really to provide financial assistance to all three of those categories. And that I became a little bit almost obsessive, and I'm sure we could like delve into that mental health wise of like whether or not I've done this. Became very obsessive about launching it on Colette's due date. And I think that was very much so September 7th. So to rename, repurpose that date, right? And so,
Yeah.
like, yes, it is Colette's due date, and there is always a little bit of sadness, but also to say, like, it's her due date, and like she's not here, but this is how she's living on,
Yeah.
and really taking that, and and that's been running since September of 2018, and then still to this day, I don't know a really good reason or anything that why I developed preeclampsia. And I think that's something that, medical research is so behind on, and
Right.
these things that, it's really just doctors, God bless them, are really like working with very limited knowledge and information about these conditions.
Yeah.
And they could not find a cause. And I never felt like they had a great plan to avoid it happening again. They had some minor things, but I never felt like it was secure enough. And so we did try one more round of IVF, that didn't take. And my husband, I remember, was, crying about this, and I felt relief and really just, how do you deal with that? And handle that kind of feeling. And so I sat with that by myself for a very long time. And then, I finally started to realize like there was options we had and there were things we could do. And so we used a gestational carrier, so surrogate, if you will, to bring home our son, and that was a great experience, and one that I love to talk about because I think all of this stuff is stuff we don't talk about, right? And it's
Yeah.
happening, and it's and so I think really just um, allowing that to be talked about and allowing, but if we're talking about growing our family, right? I now have somebody who served as our surrogate and her partner and their kids, that is part of our family too. And
Right.
so, I think it was really beautiful. And yeah, you know, so.
Really. I know. Oh, thank you so much for sharing all of that, Michelle. But you're so spot on. We were in the NICU for 5.5 weeks with Brooke, and didn't see, the day that she passed, anything happening. We were talking the day before, like her discharge dates and stuff. But that whole journey, though, that 5.5 weeks that we were in the NICU, it takes such a toll on you, like emotionally, mentally, physically. But you're right in that financial piece of it, because
Right.
you're driving back and forth from the hospital, you're, like, figuring out dinners, you're literally eating fast food or eating hospital food all the time, and it's, not that you complain about it because you don't mind doing it because 'cause you're with your baby and things like that, but it really does, like, weigh on the family so much, and then to
Right.
get the bills that you get when you get out, it's just, with your baby and you, um it is. It does take a toll on you, and, so thank you so much for what you're doing for our community and how you're, impacting, survivors and stuff like that, and also talking about the surrogacy piece, because
Mhm.
I feel like, when we were dealing with and, secondary infertility and stuff like that, getting to that place and that point where, like, we were considering other options, because, like, I feel like when you're on that journey, like, your nevers become like realities,
Mhm.
and, like, looking down different avenues and stuff like that, and, finding a surrogate and going down that route and having them a part of your life and all of that is just so beautiful, and I just appreciate you sharing about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, I think a lot of it is just, I share things that like took me a long time to find out and find other people.
Right.
And, I really, Um, my my feeling is always like, if one less person feels that, like, where are my people, or I don't know what to do, or anything like that, like,
Yes.
then I've done my job.
Right.
And I think that that's really important too, is to realize, these are things we're not talking about, that are stigmatized, that are,
Yes.
that are really, in this point in our history, are really hot button political issues, right? And like,
Yes.
all of that adds up to silence in a lot of cases, because of
Yes.
shame and guilt. I'm like, this is my story. This is my kids' stories. This is our
Yes.
family story. And so, well, let's share it, and let's bring it out and normalize a lot of it.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And it's just happening too often, to not talk about it and all of us be out there. Like we always call it the isolated alone island. You feel
Right.
like when you're living and going through this, and then all of a sudden, when you do experience, for example, when we lost Brooke, it was like, me too, me too, me too. All these people came out of the woodwork and it was
Mhm.
like, where were you? Like, oh my
Right.
goodness, because I was feeling so alone. And it is true. Like, and that is what we're trying to do here, with Chasing Rainbows is like unifying all of us across, the US and getting us all together in a room that's like, let's talk about this. Let's get it off. Like, let's process our losses together. Like, let's talk about all of it because it is so hard. And,
Right.
it's the worst thing, like you and I were talking about pre-show. It's just the worst thing that a parent can ever go through.
Mhm.
And, experiencing this and then feeling alone and isolated. So, yeah,
Right. Yeah.
I
And I
appreciate
think, we're of the first generation that's like being real and talking about
right.
these things, right? And even like, I'm thinking of talking about pregnancy. That pregnancy isn't, all sunshine and roses. Like,
No.
pregnancy sucks for a lot of people. And,
Yeah.
eh, that's okay, right? And that's, let's name that. And being a parent is amazing and wonderful and all of that. And there's also points when you just want to kind of scream and be like,
Yes.
stop, and you know, my husband and I often will say to each other, and we have those moments, we're like, oh, have kids, they said. It'll be fun, they said. We'll just sort of say that to each other, because it's true, right? Like, it's joyful and it's wonderful and it's amazing, and also has a lot of other, moments where it's a lot,
It
and
is.
and
Yeah.
that's okay. And I think we need to normalize all of that, right? To
Right.
say, like, this isn't this flowery image that I think a lot of us grew up with,
Yes.
that made a lot of those things harder, right? Like,
Right.
when my husband and I couldn't get pregnant, it made me feel like a failure, because the messaging I had always
Yes.
gotten was, you have sex and you get pregnant, right? Like, when you want to
Yeah.
decide to get pregnant, you get pregnant. And when that didn't happen, then it felt like there was something wrong with me.
Absolutely.
And, I think if we, in that, instead turn those kind of conversations around to be like, yeah, that is the hope, but that's not going to work for everybody.
No.
And, I think that that's really important and really powerful.
It really is, and trying to conceive does not equal baby, and, pregnancy does not equal baby, and
Right.
that whole dialogue that has been almost embedded in us by watching, like, princess movies when we were growing
Right.
up and, like, all these, like, fairy tales and stuff like that, hearing all of it, I think because of it's a generational difference of talking about issues and bringing it to light almost, because I felt like, parents were so used to stuffing or not talking about these things that now our generation is doing a better job because we're preparing and we're being real about it, and
Right.
bringing it to the reality and the forefront, which is something that is so important, to
Right.
just like I said, to bring that unity and connection because that's what we want as human beings. We want to find connection with others who get our story, and
Right.
understand us. And what was interesting is, and you brought it up, you and your husband, it sounds like, are such a great team because like the mental load in parenthood is a topic that now is finally like gaining the traction that it deserves. But then when there's losses involved and there's like infertility and there is reoccurring losses, that takes like your mental load to an exponential growth of
Right.
just all of it, right? And dealing with, and you said it, that guilt and the shame blame kind of thing, like we should be the shooting all over ourselves, right? Like
Right.
we should be appreciative of having another child after we've gone through all of this to get to this child, right? Or like, all those feelings, but living a life with the guilt of experiencing that versus joy. Can you touch on that a little bit too, a little
Yeah,
bit more?
absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
it's everything, right? It's all
Yeah.
of the, I think one thing that I always try to drive home is it's not just losing your child, it's all the stuff that comes with it, right? And like,
Right.
so years down the road, it's all the stuff that comes with it. And
Yeah.
there's guilt in that, right? Because, you know, I will admit, like, my vision of having kids was always having two girls, right? And that's largely because that's what I grew up with. I'm the oldest and my younger sister's my best friend. That's partially also because, like, I was sort of a girly girl and whatever. And so that's what I thought. Um, did I think I was only going to be parenting one living child? No. Did I think it was going to be a boy? No.
Yeah.
Um, and so I sometimes will feel that huge loss of not having two living children that I'm parenting, not getting to parent a girl in the way I thought I would, and feeling that, right? And then guilt comes in with it, where it's like, well, yeah, but you love your son. Yes, I do. You're right. I absolutely adore my son. I love
Right.
being a boy mom in a way that I never thought I would be loving
Yeah.
it. But I also I also had a loss of I don't get to be the girl mom in the way that I thought it would be, right?
Yeah.
I don't get to do this kinds of things. And so I think it's a lot of recognizing that you had losses of what you thought was going to be or what should have been.
Mhm.
Um, and that doesn't take away from all the good feelings that you have. It's just a matter of balancing those two to say,
It really is.
I love my living children. And also, I mourn my other child, right? And
Correct.
so it's those kinds of things that I think are so important that we recognize, we tend to have these views of like, if you're happy, you have to be entirely happy. And it's like,
Mm.
hold on. You
Yeah.
can be mostly happy and still have this like, and I wish that my daughter was here. I mean, just yesterday, in the middle of the day, we worked out, things had changed around. And so my husband and I took my son to a children's museum in our area, right? And, he loves it. We love it. But there's another level to it. Like, we really love it because although it was in a different location, when we were growing up, both my husband and I went to this museum, right? And so there's this nostalgia and history with it that we can talk about it too. And so that's really meaningful. And it's really awesome to see, he's just like becoming his own person and his personality and what what he's into and what he's, all of that. And it's beautiful and it's wonderful and it's amazing. And then also it's like, and there should be another child here, right?
Exactly.
If not two.
Yep. Yep.
Um, and then you feel that guilt of like, why am I taking away from this moment? And it's like, no, I
Yeah.
can be, whatever, if you want to talk percentages, I can be 85, 90%, 95%, 99% happy and still have this like one part
Yeah.
of me that
Yes.
says, and this piece of our family is missing. And that's okay, right?
Right.
There's nothing wrong with that. And we allow that to happen. We allow that feeling to happen when we talk about other losses, right?
Right.
So, thinking about, I've had friends who their mother has passed away before they have their baby, right? And then they talk about all this joy, but they say, like, I really wish my mom was here. Okay. And
Exactly.
we acknowledge that and we allow people to say that, right? Um, so why don't we do the same courtesy to people who are missing a child?
It's true.
And I don't know why we don't do that, and then that's something I think is really important is to, think about this. And for as different as baby loss is on so many different levels, right?
Right.
And to other losses and grief, there's also a lot of similarities, right? And the same things that we would lend to the person who's grieving a parent, a grandparent, a sibling, a spouse, whatever. Some of those same things that we grant to them, we should be granting to our,
Yeah.
to lost parents as well.
Absolutely. And I think like, with our society and how it is, not wanting to talk about baby loss because it is so horrific. No one wants to think about an innocent
Right.
little baby dying, right? I get that. However, though, you're so spot on because it's like, we do accept people grieving spouses, parents, grandparents and things, and making those comments and, you know, on their wedding day, during big events when they're, you know, having a baby or whatever, like, I wish my parents were here to witness this. And it's like, yeah, but like, you know, we have to live in all these special moments. Like, yeah, like I wish Brooke was here to experience this. You know, I wish my baby was here to experience this. And because there is always that silhouette that I envision when we're going on family vacations, holidays, of what Brooke would be and how she would be interacting with children, because I am missing, you know, we are missing that piece of our heart,
Yeah.
and we're always going to be missing that piece from our life. And I think it's acknowledging it too. It kind of takes the power away from that like false guilt that we're feeling, because like, you know, the guilt is valid, of course, because we all experience it. We go through it at one point or another, especially when I'm caught up in the moment. And then all of a sudden I'm like, oh, you know, and it like shocks me. And I'm like, oh yeah, Brooke's not here. But, you know, then it's also acknowledging like it's okay to feel that way. And it's okay
Right.
to say like, that she's not here, of course, right,
Right.
Michelle? So I loved how you put that, and it's true. Um, yeah, and, you know, I think too, like, another aspect outside of that, right, and, like, that's in and of itself enough, right, that we have to go through, but then it's also, like, that fear and trust, like, versus each other, right, and, like, trying to figure that out, because that's a whole other, you know, dynamic too, is, like, trusting our gut instincts again as parents, as mothers, but then, like, not living a life in fear because we had the worst thing happen to us that
Right.
possibly could.
Right.
And, you know, so it is like trying to find that balance. And I don't know how you do it, or, you know, or what you experience with that.
Right.
But I know for me, it's difficult, something
Right.
hard. I have to turn it over every day. Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing that my husband reminds me about is that I insisted upon this OB appointment that led to everything with Colette, just because something told me that I needed to go to the OB,
Right.
right? And so despite even the nurses calling and telling me, like, "You don't really need to come in," and all of that, and me insisting, like, "I'm coming in, so,
Yeah.
like, deal with it," you know, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, to my husband who, like, yes, didn't say this outwardly, but, like, I know him well enough, was sort of thinking, like, you're being a little paranoid." But he says,
Right.
like, that intuition led you to it, and that got us 9 days with her, right? And so, like,
Right.
we don't know what would have happened, right? If I was walking around and I didn't have any symptoms, or I now realize some symptoms that I chalked up to normal pregnancy were probably related to the beginnings of preeclampsia, but I wasn't acknowledging those. So
You
we
didn't
don't know what
know.
would have
We don't know
happened,
until we
right? Like
don't
I had
know.
a high blood pressure that like was getting close to like risks of stroke and all of that. And so like, I don't know. So I think it's going back and saying, here's my mom instinct that's telling me this, and I need to listen to it. But it gets complicated because intertwined with that is our loss experience that, you know, simple things that happen with kids can be really triggering and can lead us down a whole path, right? And so,
Yes.
you know, it's the mental toll that it takes of, you know, not of trying to tell yourself that the worst thing is not going to necessarily happen just because it feels like it in that moment.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think that's really hard. So I think of things like, you know, I think of somebody I had a play, you know, we had a play date. And so moms and you know, our 2 boys were playing, and we went to get lunch, and we were coming back, and we had to cross a busy street, and we were against lights, we were waiting for light. And my son took 1 step off the curb, and I pulled him
Mm.
right back in. But, like, my reaction was I bent down and I was really I was like, "You cannot do that," and in a way that I'm not usually as a mom. And then I sort of, like, realized, and I you know, so I turned to the other mom and I said, "I'm really sorry." I'm like, "That just really freaked me out." And she was like, "No, I get it." Um, and I think she really did. But the problem is, like, what I had seen in my head happening in those, like, seconds
Oh
of
yeah.
was he's gonna walk out of the street, a big semi truck is gonna come through, and he's gonna be dead. And so, like, I went through that in my head in those seconds. And so, like, it's really hard to bring yourself back from that to, like, okay, so he took 1 step off the plant, like, he was not in danger. I
The
grabbed him really
reality. I
quickly.
know.
He
I
was
know.
fine, you know, all of those things. And I think that's really hard for lost parents is to not, you know, is to stop ourselves from like, right, our brains are going to go there because of trauma,
Yes.
because of experience, right? And like, how do we
Right.
bring ourselves back to the current to say like, okay, that's not really the case. Because kids are going to test their boundaries and they're going to do stuff and, all of that stuff that they're going to do. And I think also coupled with the fact of, you know, I think for those of us who have lost, right, we have often found ourselves falling into the like small minority of cases, right? So, you know, um, we talk about viability, for example, right? And Colette, we made it to 24 weeks. And I remember when we made it to 24 weeks, us celebrating because that's viability, right?
Right.
Um,
Right.
but here's the thing, it's really like 50%, 60%, depending of survival rates, which that means a lot of other people aren't doing this. All of those kinds of things that fall into those minorities. So when we get information going forward and people say like, oh, it's like less than 10% of kids that this happens to, we feel like that's our kid then. That's immediately
Right.
going to be our kid.
100%. Go right down
And,
that.
I think one thing that I always try to do is, doing a lot of work with practitioners to say like, that's not actually a comfort to most lost parents.
No.
And so like, you can tout that and like to most of your parents, like they're going to be like, okay, cool. I get it. Like so it's not common to happen, but your lost parent is going to sit in that common and
Oh yeah.
that's where they're going to sit. So like, you need to frame that better. Right. And I think of having a COVID baby and being paranoid all the time about that, right?
Oh,
Our first pediatrician, for many reasons, we changed pediatricians. And largely was after the 6-month visit, one of the things that really bothered me was that, it was at a time where I felt like the rest of the world was starting to return to normal. He was too young for a mask. There wasn't a vaccine. And so it felt very like, what are we doing with this? And I mentioned that to her and I said, I'm really nervous about this. I don't know what to do. And she launched this whole thing about how, infants were not really getting very sick with this. They weren't dying at the same rates. All of this stuff. And she tells me all of this and I kind of let her do her thing. And then I said to her, that sounds really great, but given our history and our experience, that's not comforting to me.
No.
And she looked at me and she said, I know, and then just moved on with the appointment. And it was kind of like, but where did you leave me in this? Like, even like if you were able to acknowledge and to recognize that this was not comforting, where was the like follow-up to say, okay, I know it's not really comforting, but let's take solace in the fact of like, this is what you're doing. And this is what, and we are doing our absolute best. And, and we will continue to talk about this as things develop, like all of that. And I didn't get that from her.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's what you needed. Yeah.
And that's what I needed. Right. And so like now we have a pediatrician and yes, I think part of the reason why I love her is that she herself, she was actually the pediatrician on call when Elliot was born. And she was the only one who came in and checked on, on us as parents and then disclosed to us that she had lost a child and did this. And I think, for me, that's a huge comfort because it's like you are the medical and you're in the brain, but you also know that heart of that fear that you have all the time, just constantly. And so to me, it's like, I can see that. And I feel like I'm getting back a sympathetic, but super knowledgeable person who's saying, I recognize what you're saying. Okay, now let's some medical science. And like, let's also understand that like, we're going to do things. And, and she says things to me that are helpful. She says, her kids are older, but she'll say like, what I did with my kids. And it's like, okay, so you're doing this as the medical provider and also as a mom and a mom who lost. And, I think that that's a huge thing. And I'm always so grateful that she disclosed that to us, right? She didn't need to, but she did. And that's really comforting and helpful to me to know that when we're going in and seeing that we have that extra support.
And it's having that community behind you and just knowing that another lost parent is right there with you and that they get it. Like they're not going to question you. They already know. And it's that like automatic like connection that we have with them and it's an understanding and they don't, need any further explanation because I'm almost so tired, and I don't know how you feel about this, Michelle, of almost having to explain yourself after loss, and having to explain like why we do things a certain way. Like you were bringing up about, like your son stepping off the curb a little bit. Like another lost mom would have gotten that, like been right there with you, and
Right.
maybe could have, added some insight or been there, in a different way or whatever the case is. But it's like truly have gotten that. And there is something to be said because, that fear versus trust, like we are so hyper vigilant and like we have these illusions now. And it's trauma responses from what we've been through and the triggers and things like that. And we play out every case scenario down. I know I do, down different, like how this would play out. And I obsess about it because that does take us right back to those moments and those days that we lost our baby in the most horrific, traumatic way. And, you know, the flu, right? Like our family just got hit with the flu. Well, our daughter is under 2 and she, is in the high risk category. And
Mhm.
so I went down rabbit holes like, oh my goodness, she is exhibiting symptoms. Here we go. Like, oh my goodness, are we going to lose another child? And I think it was really important that like my husband could like rein me in a little bit too with
Mhm.
it, but also having really good medical providers that were like, let's start a prophylactic dose of Tamiflu with her. Let's do this. Let's do that. And I was just like, okay, well, I'm feeling seen and heard. Like people are actually understanding it. And not that I wasn't worried about like our older son and stuff like that, but like he's not high risk. And it really was like, okay, how do we handle this?
Right.
And it is all of that because,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure, for sure. And and I can see it, I very recently, and I told you about this before. My sister had her first
Right.
in September. So what is that, little over 6 months at this point? I can't I can't
Yeah.
do math.
I know
Anyways,
math.
um,
Yeah.
but I see how she parents, and she parents very differently because she's not a lost mom. And
Yes.
she had a baby who, at his 6-month visit will get his COVID shot, right? Elliot was 23 months before there was a vaccine available for his age.
Right.
And, and even that, right? Like once that was available, I was making sure I got our very first appointment with our hospital system for the under 5 vaccine.
Yeah.
Because I was so diligent and I just needed that feeling of relief of like, there was just this huge sigh, even just after the
Yes.
first dose, right? He had 3 shots, but just even after
Right.
the first dose, it was like he has some protection, right? And so like everything we've been doing and then a little bit more of protection felt so helpful and so
Yes.
just like such a huge relief and like a huge point where you could just go, okay,
Yes.
and do that. And I think that those kinds of things are really different and really, I mean, you want to talk about safe sleep? I mean, I know safe sleep backwards, forwards, upside down,
Oh my goodness. Yes.
diagonally,
Yep.
whatever. And we follow those to a T and even more protective, right? So,
Oh,
things that
yeah.
they said you would do at 1 year and old, we didn't do for a while. Because it was like, well, just in case like medical science hasn't figured out,
Yeah.
maybe it's like 18 months, let's just go a little bit longer. Do all of those things. And I think
Yeah.
that that's a product of being lost parents and
It really
just being
is.
paranoid. And,
Absolutely.
and also I think in that too, when we talk about sickness, right, it's not only just our child and, are they going to survive? Are they okay? And all of that. But it's also like, I don't want my child to get another child sick so that another parent has to feel this way. Right. And so like,
Yes.
that's very hard. We had, uh, our son got RSV in
Oh
the
boy.
fall. And,
Yeah.
another really scary thing. And he was good.
Yes.
I mean, he was fine, but we had seen he wasn't feeling very well. We were going to kind of, make the call about preschool the next morning. My husband made the call and sent him to preschool. And midway through the day, they called us that he had a fever. And so we picked him up and took him to the doctors, and he did have RSV. And like, I remember being very much like, oh my God, our choice is going to kill another child too, because they don't
Oh,
want other
no.
parents to feel this way, right?
Right.
And so it's on so many different levels that there's just this heightened awareness and this
Yeah.
knowledge and this really truly, I mean, I feel that experience in my soul, and I don't want other parents to have to feel that way. And
Right.
so as a result, like I'm hyper vigilant and I'm, overly cautious. And I think it's a hard balance, right? Because we don't want our kids to grow up with this like fear of the world
Yes,
and,
exactly.
all this stuff. And I have a kid who's fearless. And like on many of the reasons, I love that about him. And on other things that causes me stress and anxiety that like is a
A whole
lot,
new
right?
level.
And
Yeah.
so like how do you balance those two kind of shifts? And I think it's really being cautious and also like trying to, knock ourselves back into the present of like our child is okay
Right.
right now. And,
Right.
taking it the day by day and,
Yes.
not going all of a sudden or when we do go all of a sudden is to try to like rein ourselves back in, to have people around us to rein us back in.
That's who we
You know,
trust. Yeah, exactly
right.
right. Right.
And I mean, my parenting questions, I have a group of lost mom friends and we're all on a group chat. And I can't tell you how many times it's just like, oh my God, this happened and this is where I went. And just to get back the like, I get it. Oh my God, I've been there, kind
Right.
of things makes a difference.
It does. It does make all the difference in the world,
Right.
especially, and what's interesting is I thought like once we got like our pregnancy after loss, right, with Faye, and once we had her in our arms, that I like would feel like a sense of relief, which I did 100% felt
Right.
that sense of
Absolutely.
relief and was just like, oh, thank goodness she's here, she's safe. But then that safe sleep, let me tell you, my husband, oh my goodness, Michelle, God love him. But I got so many different baby monitors where they would monitor the breathing, monitor everything in their sleep, monitor like their weight, their, all of her stuff to try them out because like I needed to make sure that like nothing happened in those first 12 like SIDS or any of that safe sleep stuff. And like I was fully aware something was going on because then alarms would set off and never did alarm go off, thank goodness, knock on wood. But it was like, I couldn't be protected enough. And
Mhm.
only other lost moms got that. Cause like
Right.
everybody else was like, well, you're being a little, and like we also had one of those bassinets, so one of those smart bassinets. So they also like monitored everything too. And I know that's like a little, it seems over the top, but not,
Mhm.
you
Right.
get it.
No,
Like,
absolutely. For
yeah,
sure. For
right there.
sure. I mean, my son is almost 4 and I literally every night I cannot go to sleep until I have gone into his room and I have put my hand on his back and felt him
Yes.
breathing up and down,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And that was something that I thought would go away and it hasn't.
I know.
And, you know, um, and it's really helpful for both of us. My husband's like, you do it because I think it's like you doing the action is more helpful for you. But he was like, but I appreciate that you do that every day and that you're like, okay, he's okay.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. Uh, and I think that that's something too that's really important, right? You're not supposed to like go in and disturb a sleeping child.
Right.
Um, but like you're going to sometimes.
Yes.
And like having to work around that, having people who, back you up and are saying like, yes, I'm on board for you to be doing that.
Yes.
My joke is often like, uh, when he goes away to college, I don't know what's going to happen. Like, am I going to
Right.
have to like get the room next
You
door
can
and
live
move in and just be like, okay, um,
except,
and,
I mean, I get it.
whatever that
Yeah.
looks like. But, I think just recognizing those things of like, that's coming from a different perspective and a different, worldview than most parents have, right? And that's okay. It's figuring out how to navigate that into your world and being okay with
Absolutely.
that. And I think that's really hard.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I appreciate you, sharing about that because these things aren't really discussed or talked about, right? Like you don't, and I was not aware of all of these things before becoming a lost mom, right? Like I
Right.
never like knew, like you said, it's all those secondary losses, it's all the things afterwards that we don't know or don't see that really
Mhm.
affect us. And parenting after loss is one of them. And there's so many other things that we wanted to touch on today. So I feel like we do need to do a second segment together so then we can get those other ones out for our listeners as long as you're good with it. And because
Absolutely.
there's just so much on this topic that isn't said out loud that
Mhm.
I feel like we just all have to come together. We all have to talk about
Right,
these things
right.
and get them
Yeah.
out there. So yeah,
Yeah,
I
and I
can't
think,
think.
one thing I wanna say, like, in response to your thing about pregnancy is, like, I think a lot of the world thinks once you have another child, you're, like, healed magically,
Oh, oh, I can't.
and,
I know. I know.
like, that's not the case, right? And yes, was bringing home a child healing? Yes, absolutely, on so many levels. Was it also super triggering? Yes, so many
Oh
levels,
my
like,
God.
and even that kind of, like, balance of this. So I think, where there's a lot of people who are like, "Oh, okay, so you got to this point, now you have another child, and, like, I'm done, I don't need to
You're good.
support you anymore." You're like, "Actually, I kinda need more support right now than I did before this."
Yes. Yes.
And it's a little bit different, but it's still there, and I think that that's also a really
Yeah.
important piece that we need
Because you
to.
really are living like if you're pregnant after loss or or you have a surrogate that's pregnant with your baby, all of those things, you're reliving that trauma every single day of that pregnancy.
Absolutely,
And
for
it's like,
sure.
when am I going to get the phone call or when am I going to know something's or what if something is happening? I can't tell you how many times I was in labor and delivery getting checked with our pregnancy after loss, and then just everything after. And so what, we need to do those things, but it was because I was living those triggers. But then also, it really is like everybody expects, like, okay, well, now you have a baby, like you're good. And it's like, so you're telling me that if one of your 4 children died, you'd be good because you have 3 other ones. I'm just
Yeah,
making sure, like, that's what I'm hearing from you. And
yeah.
it's like, so what is the difference here? And
I
if
have a
losing a
friend
baby,
I have a
yes, it's
friend
like,
who won't speak to me anymore because she said something about God needing another angel, and I said,
oh,
"Okay,
I
so then
can't.
which one of your children would you like to give up?" And she got really mad and she said, "I can't believe you would say that." And I was like, "Well, I can't believe you would say that to me." So,
Right,
like, I'm just
exactly
trying to
right.
put back into context for you.
Just like putting this
Um,
into perspective, just making sure you
and
understand
she really
the,
just was offended by it and just, that was it. And I was like, "Okay, but I need you to understand, like, that wasn't comforting to me." And in
no.
fact, it was actually really triggering because, like, how dare you? You know?
Exactly right, like, God has a plan or you'll see it someday be revealed, and
Right.
it's like, "No, nope, I
Yeah.
don't believe that," and I think that is something that doesn't sit right because I questioned my faith, I questioned everything, and to this day, I have a different view and relationship and stuff like that with whatever you wanna say, or not say, and it's one of those things that, I don't believe that. Yeah, I
Right.
don't at all, never will. Now, if a survivor does wanna believe that and finds comfort in it, great, and, like, good for them, but also they might say it one day and then not believe it the next, and, like, the thing
Absolutely,
is
for
that
sure.
you just need people that are there behind you listening to you, and it's
Right.
not that I don't need fixed, I don't need you to have a positive, like, thing after this or, like, really, like, voice something and make me feel really good. No, I don't need that. You're going to make me feel more isolated and alone and feel like I have to stuff my feelings because I can't vocalize how I'm feeling?
Right. Yeah. Yeah,
So
for
true.
sure. Definitely. Definitely. And
Yeah,
that's why I
that
say,
toxic.
like, platitudes are not helpful. They're in a
No,
better place. You
nope,
know,
nope. I
God
will
needed
never
another
believe
angel,
that.
all
I will never
it's not
believe that as
helpful,
their parent.
right?
Nope, not helpful.
And once you listen to a lost parent, if they are reflecting that that kind of stuff is helpful, then sure, of course,
Right,
be willing to share.
right.
But don't think that you providing these words of wisdom makes anything better. You're not gonna fix it, like you said.
Especially when it comes from someone who hasn't been through it. And, like, I think that's the hardest thing too, because it's
Right.
like you're saying this, and I get maybe you heard it from one person one time, or you hear it from, like, a different kind of loss, but like you said, don't say it to a lost parent. And, like, I will never believe that my child is better off not being in my arms. Will never
Right.
believe that?
Absolutely. For sure.
So, yeah.
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 Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle, and thanks for,
Mhm.
ending us with that and for sharing everything. We appreciate you being on here for our lost survivors, and it just means so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Please follow or subscribe to our podcast to help us reach more survivors. We all want to come together, to have that unity and connection. And we are always with you, baby lost survivors. Until next time.